we could talk about purposeful and accidental subversion. So let's start with the Marxists with regard to purposeful subversion. Okay, so Karl Marx split the world into oppressor and oppressed in an envious manner, presuming that all the moral virtue was with the oppressed and all the evil was with the oppressor, and that all could be understood from within the framework of economics. So the primary axis of oppression and oppressed for Marx was the economic axis. And he presumed that the reason that inequality between oppressor and oppressed exists was because of the structure of capitalism. At least that's what he claimed. Now, whether or not he believed that is a whole different issue. Okay, so now I want to take that in two directions. I want to point to how that's metastasized into what I think is less than ideally conceptualized as cultural Marxism. And I want to also discuss its precursors, its archetypal precursors, okay? So what seems to me to have happened, and I want your thoughts on this, is that Marx established the framework for an elaborated victim-victimizer narrative. But he basically stuck to the economic realm when he made that case. Now, as the revolution unfolded, what we found out was that the subversion of the capitalist order in favor of the oppressed only produced the universalization of poverty and produced no viable redistribution of equity or income. And so by the 1970s, the hollowness of the economic approach to the victim-victimizer had been demonstrated so thoroughly that even idiot Marxists in France were forced to accept it. And so you know the proof is compelling when a French intellectual is forced to swallow it. And so then what happened, as far as I could tell, is the postmodernists, who were all Marxist at their core, decided that there was no utility in beating the economic inequality drum anymore, but that they could fragment the victim-victimizer narrative into a metastasis and say, well, the basic idea that it was a power dynamic that ruled everything was correct. But we underestimated the seriousness of the power dynamic because it shows up in the relationship between men and women, and it shows up in the patriarchal structure of the family, and it shows up in the dynamic of sex, and then the dynamic of gender and race and ethnicity. So all of a sudden, you
and
have the same
colonization between countries.
Sure, between races, between tribes. You can understand the postmodern claim was that even though they purported to dispense with the idea of a superordinate meta-narrative, they smuggled in the power narrative as the fundamental exploratory concept and then metastasized it to explain the relations between human beings regardless of how they categorized themselves, so that every group categorization became a locus of power and exploitation. Right, and so now we have a metastatic Marxism. Okay, so that's bringing it forward. Now I want to bring it backward, and you tell me what you think about this, because I think Marxism itself is a variant of something more deeper, much deeper. So there's a Marxist-like spirit that inverts the French Revolution soon after it occurs. And that was well before Marx. And I've been thinking more archetypally, let's say, in relationship to fundamental stories, that Marxism is a variant, Marxism versus capitalism, let's say, as a variant of the story of Cain and Abel, right? Because Cain and Abel is really the first victim-victimizer narrative. And it basically presents the human moral landscape, because it's the first story about human beings in history, right? Because Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, let's say. Cain and Abel are the first two human beings that are born in the world of history. And they develop modes of being that are antithetical to one another, with Cain being the oppressed, angry, bitter, malevolent, murderous, and then genocidal victim, and Abel being the successful, right, the successful individual who strives forward, aims up, and makes the proper sacrifices. Now, that's presented in the biblical corpus as the fundamental spiritual division, and Cain's failure to make the proper offering and then his rebellion against God. Like, there's a Luciferian touch to that, and it's definitely something that attracted Marx, because Marx was a admirer of Mephistopheles, of Goethe's Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles was the variant of the usurping spirit whose motivation was nothing but destruction. You know, you talked about the attack on all the levels of subsidiary society simultaneously, right? I mean, the Marxists definitely planned that. We can't have marriage because men and women are in a power battle. We can't have families because the family is a patriarchal, oppressive institution. We can't have communities because all power should be deeded to the state, ceded to the state, etc. But it seems to me that all of that has that roots in that fundamental antagonism that's laid out initially in the story of Cain and Abel. And what we are seeing is we're seeing variants of that story play out, and also at an accelerated rate because of the rate of technological change.